Good evening, everyone. Tonight, you will become a medieval minstrel, and we will walk through your long and wandering life together. You start as a serf boy who isn't even worthy of a surname, singing and walking all the way, chased away, celebrated, forgotten, until the very end of the road. Now dim the lights, and let's step into tonight's story with the sound of church bells. You were born in the early 12th century in the south of France. Your father was a serf, and your mother was a serf too. For 3 generations, your family had grown turnips on the same plot of land, a plot that belonged to a lord you might never lay eyes on in your whole life. You had no surname, only a first name. Your fate took a turn on an autumn evening. You were sent to deliver a basket of vegetables to the Lord's manor. You set the basket down at the back door of the kitchen and was about to leave when you suddenly heard a sound you had never heard before from the great hall. It was the sound of a vielle, a medieval bowed string instrument that looked a little like the later violin, but was larger in size and had a hoarser tone, like an old man playing the fiddle. The one playing it was singing a song about a knight from far away. You could barely understand the lyrics, for they were sung in Occitan, while the language you spoke daily was a rough local dialect. But the melody reached straight into your chest, stirring something deep within you. You knelt by the window and listened in secret all night long. In the Middle Ages, eavesdropping on a noble's feast was a punishable offense. At the very least, a beating, and at worst, having your ears cut off. So as you huddled by that window, you were gambling with your ears. But you won the bet. No one found you, and beneath that window, you made a decision that would change your life forever. You wanted to be the one who sang. Yet you were only the son of a serf, and you didn't even have an instrument of your own. So your eyes turned to the church. There was an old psaltery in the church's storage room, a flat stringed instrument, shaped like a squash triangle, played by plucking the strings while resting it on one's knees. The psaltery had been gathering dust in a corner of the storage room for ages, because the only monk in town who knew how to play it had fallen gravely ill the previous winter and had never touched it since. So on a moonless night, you stole it away. Clutching the stolen psaltery, you hid in a hayloft outside the village and began to teach yourself to play. The process was far more painful than you had imagined. The strings of the psaltery were taut, and blisters formed on your fingertips on the very first day. By the 3rd day, the blisters had burst, and by the 7th, hard calluses had started to form. But you did not give up. 2 months later, you could finally pluck out some melodies that were not too harsh on the ears. But you knew it was still far from enough. You needed a music teacher. But in the French countryside of the 12th century, where could you possibly find one? Your only choice was to take your chances on the road, waiting for a passing minstrel, and then trying to persuade him to take you as his apprentice. He appeared on the morning of a market day. When you first saw him, you could barely tell he was a minstrel. He looked more like a tramp who had been kicked by a donkey one too many times. His hair was a tangled bird's nest, and the patches on his cloak outnumbered the original cloth. But slung over his back was a vielle, its wooden body worn smooth and shiny from being held, and played day in and day out for years. You summoned up all your courage and walked up to him, telling him you wanted to learn to sing, to play the instrument, to be a minstrel. He looked you up and down and asked what you could do. You said you could play a little on the psaltery. He told you to play for him. You did. He fell silent for about 10 seconds, then spoke. Your finger positions are all wrong, but your sense of rhythm is not half bad. And just like that, you became his apprentice. He told you his name was Bernard. After hitting the road with Bernard, you found that life as an apprentice was about much more than just learning music. You had to wake up earlier than him every morning to start a fire and make porridge. More often than not, your breakfast was hard bread dipped in water. Then you had to pack his belongings in spare strings, a roll of parchment covered in lyrics, a small jar of ink, his change of clothes, and all manner of odds and ends. Your only possessions in the world were the stolen psaltery and the clothes on your back. The first lesson Bernard taught you was not music, but how to walk. He told you a minstrel walked thousands of kilometers a year, and if you didn't walk the right way, your feet would be ruined in 3 months. He taught you how to bind your lower legs to protect your calves, how to adjust your stride to save energy on long journeys, how to tell if a road was safe. For example, if the bushes by the roadside had been cut open artificially, it was likely an ambush spot for robbers. Bernard's second lesson was music, but his way of teaching was nothing like what you had imagined. He would not tell you to play one note then another. Instead, he would sit by the roadside and tell you to listen to the wind, to the birdsong, to the sound of the river in the distance, to the rattle of ox-cart wheels rolling over the stony road. Then he would say, "Melodies are not something you make up. They are something you pick up from the world." You did not understand then, but you would come to know what he meant many years later. The third lesson was learning to take criticism. Bernard had a terrible temper. If you sang a wrong note, he would make you start over 10 times. If you fumbled a chord, he would stare at you with a terrifying look in his eyes. But he never hit you. In an age where violence was the first resort, that was already a sign of great good breeding. Once, you could no longer bear his criticism and cried secretly in the middle of the night. He pretended not to see, but the next morning, he gave you an extra piece of bread. After traveling with Bernard for about 2 months, you had learned far more than just music. He taught you how to find your way, how to tell north from south by the way moss grows, how to judge if anyone lived upstream by the color of the river water. He taught you how to read people, which travelers you could strike up a conversation with, which ones you should stay far away from. He taught you the tricks of begging for food. Wait at the gate of a monastery until noon, and the monks would usually give passes by a bowl of thin porridge and a piece of bread, sing a harvest song beside a busy market, and a peasant woman might soften her heart and give you a handful of dried fruit. He also taught you the craft of the minstrel. In an age without recording devices, a minstrel stored all their ballads in their memory. Bernard would make you listen to a song over and over, then demand that you sing it word for word the next morning. If you forgot a single line, he would make you start all over again. Slowly you grew better. Your fingers became more and more dexterous, your voice more and more steady, and the number of songs stored in your memory grew and grew. Bernard still rarely praised you, but the number of times he scolded you dropped noticeably. In his world, That was the highest form of approval. After traveling with him for about 6 months, you thought you were finally ready to write a song of your own. When Bernard heard your idea, he wore a most peculiar expression. But he did not stop you. "Go on then," he said. "Write it and sing it for me when you are done." And so you began your first attempt at creation. You sat under an oak tree, your psaltery in your arms, your mind racing as you wondered what to write about. You looked at the scenery before you, a meadow, a few sheep grazing with their heads down, occasionally lifting them to stare at you with empty, unblinking eyes. You decided to write a song about the fields. You spent 3 days writing it, revising it countless times, and finally took the finished work to Bernard. He took the crumpled piece of parchment, read it for about 30 seconds, then looked up and said, "2 of the rhymes are off. The imagery is too blunt, and the ending is rushed." Your heart sank to the bottom of your chest. Then he said, "But the metaphor at the start is good. Tweak it, and it'll work." That evening, you sat by the campfire playing the psaltery and singing the song you had revised over and over again. Your audience included Bernard, 2 stray dogs passing by, and a few sheep in the distant meadow. You had no idea that soon enough, you would have far more listeners than that. It was an autumn afternoon, late in the season, when you and Bernard walked into the lands of a castle belonging to a viscount named Guillaume. Bernard had been here before, and he was on good terms with the steward of the castle. He told you to straighten your clothes. You looked down at your stained, rough linen tunic, then did your best to smooth your hair and wipe the mud from your face, for the most part anyway. Bernard looked at you and sighed. "Never mind," he said. "It'll have to do." The moment the castle gates opened, you caught a whiff of a smell you had never known before. Not the smell of mud and livestock, but a mix of roasted meat, spices, and candle wax. Tapestries hung on the walls of the great hall, rushes covered the floor, and the fire in the fireplace blazed merrily. A long table was laden with food, some of which you could not even name. In medieval Europe, a castle's great hall was more than just a place to eat. It was the heart of noble social life. Feasts, trials, audiences with foreign guests, negotiations of marriage, all the most important events took place there, and the minstrel's role in this space was something like a combination of a modern banquet band, a stand-up comedian, and a purveyor of gossip. You had to not only sing to entertain the guests, but also tell the news, crack jokes, and even pass messages between different guests. Bernard went on first. He played 3 songs, each one perfectly timed. The first was a paean to the lord of the castle, feeding the viscount's vanity. The second was a tale of a knight's adventures in a far-off land, piquing the guests' curiosity. The third was a soft love poem, moving the ladies to dab at their eyes with their handkerchiefs. Then Bernard gave you a nod. Your turn. Your legs suddenly felt as heavy as lead. Clutching your instrument, you walked to the center of the great hall, and all eyes turned to you. You saw the viscount holding a wine cup, his expression a mix of curiosity and indifference. You saw his lady lean forward slightly, as if in anticipation. You took a deep breath and began to play. You played the song you had written yourself, but you had revised it, adding a verse about the autumn harvest, because Bernard had told you that when singing for nobles, you had to make them feel as if you were praising their lands. Your fingers trembled at the start, and you hit a wrong note, but you pretended it was an intentional grace note and kept going. By the second verse, your voice had steadied, and by the end, you even added an impromptu trill, something Bernard had never taught you, but something you had picked up by watching him perform. The great hall fell silent for 2 seconds. Then the Viscount clapped ons. But in the courtly etiquette of the Middle Ages, that was already a fine mark of approval. That night, you ate the best meal of your life: stewed meat, bread, cheese, and even a small cup of wine. You and Bernard were given a straw mat in a corner of the great hall to sleep on. As you lay there, listening to the crackle of burning wood in the fireplace, you thought that if every day could be like this, your life would not be so bad at all. Of course, every day could never be like this. Early the next morning, you and Bernard were politely shown out of the castle. The steward gave Bernard a few copper coins and a small sack of provisions, and nodded at you. "You are a good young man," he said. As you walked down the path away from the castle, you asked Bernard when you could come back. He looked at you and said, "When they want to hear a new song." You soon discovered that in the trade of minstrelsy, there was one type of song that was the most popular, the most profitable, and also the most vexing for you: the courtly love poem. Courtly love was one of the most unique cultural inventions of the Middle Ages. It usually followed a set formula. A knight or poet of lowly status falls in love with a high-born married lady. He can never have her, but his love is so pure and exalted that the love itself is enough to make him a better man. He writes poems for her, sighs for her, suffers for her, while she stands high above him, occasionally bestowing a smile or a handkerchief as encouragement. As a minstrel, your job was to turn this philosophy of love into song. Almost every noble in every castle wanted to hear these songs. Noble men thought they represented the highest ideal of chivalry, and noble women thought they finally had someone who understood the emotional plight of their arranged marriages. In any case, everyone got what they wanted. Bernard taught you the art of writing courtly love poems. He said a good courtly love poem had to follow 3 rules. First, the love must be unrequited. If you wrote of them living happily ever after, it was not courtly love, it was a fairy tale. Second, the woman must always be an object of adoration, written as perfect as the Virgin Mary herself. Third, suffering was an essential ingredient. Love without suffering was not worth singing about. You secretly thought this logic was a little warped, but you studied it earnestly all the same. Your first attempt was a failure. After reading it, Bernard said, "You compared the lady to a turnip flower. Are you serious?" You argued that you truly thought turnip flowers were beautiful. He rolled his eyes and told you to read more classic works before trying again. Gradually you mastered the craft. You learned to use dawn as a symbol of parting, the nightingale as a stand-in for your own heart, the garden as a metaphor for a secret emotional space. Your songs grew more and more polished, and you began to receive warm receptions in the castles you passed through. One countess even gave you a silver coin, a fortune to you at the time. You sewed the silver coin into the lining of your clothes, and you could feel it pressing against your ribs as you walked. You could not bear to spend it, for it was proof that someone thought your songs were worth that much. The feeling meant more than the silver coin itself. But sometimes even money could not solve the problems you faced on the road. The roads of the Middle Ages were a place where you could lose your life at any moment. The surfaces were little more than compacted earth, turning into a swamp after rain, your feet sinking in so deep you could barely pull them out. In winter, when the roads froze over, it was even worse. Every step could send you slipping and tumbling down a hillside. They usually hid at the edge of forests or around bends in mountain roads, in groups of 3 to 5, armed with homemade weapons, sometimes knives, sometimes just sharpened sticks. For a minstrel, you usually had nothing of great value on you. A few copper coins, a piece of bread, a musical instrument. But the robbers did not care. To them, a fiddle could be traded for a few days' worth of food on the black market. Bernard taught you a few self-defense tricks. Never stay on the road after dark. When passing through a forest, walk as close to the center of the road as possible and stay away from the bushes on either side. If you hear strange bird calls, the kind that should not be heard in this season, it is most likely not a bird at all, but a signal between robbers. Besides robbers, there was another thing you had to fear on the road: disease. You fell gravely ill twice on your travels. Once you ate something unclean and spent 3 days vomiting and having diarrhea, nearly dying of dehydration. It was a herbal broth that Bernard begged from a peasant woman that saved you. The other time, a blister on your foot became infected, swelling up like a small steamed bun, every step a stab of pain, like walking on a knife's edge. Bernard used a red-hot knife to lance the pus, and the entire time you bit down on a piece of cloth, nearly tearing it in two. But you survived. In the Middle Ages, surviving itself was an achievement. You kept walking from one town to another, from one castle to the next. You braved the muddy roads of spring, the scorching heat of summer, the cold rains of autumn, and the bitter, cutting winds of winter. The soles of your feet grew thicker than the soles of leather boots, and your voice, worn rough by countless cold mornings, took on a unique hoarseness, a hoarseness that made your songs sound even better. Bernard said, "The road is a minstrel's school. The longer you stay in this classroom, the better your songs will be." He also said something else, which you did not pay much attention to at the time, but would find yourself thinking about over and over again later. The most terrifying thing on the road is not robbers, nor disease, it is loneliness. As you looked at his face when he said it, you suddenly realized that before he became your mentor, he had probably walked the roads alone for many years, walking alone across the endless wilderness, with no one to talk to, no one to listen to him play, only your own shadow and the sound of your footsteps for company. You tried to imagine that kind of life, but you could not, for at that moment you had Bernard by your side. Later, when he was no longer with you, you would finally come to feel the loneliness he spoke of. It was something more enduring than hunger, more stubborn than disease. It would not kill you, but it would gnaw away at your spirit little by little, making you doubt in the depths of some nights why you kept on walking. But that was all in the future. For now, You were young, the road stretched out long before you, and your dreams of the future were as vast as the fields. Market days were your busiest days. Hundreds of people crowded among the temporary stalls, cloth merchants hawking their wares, livestock traders herding pigs, spice sellers trying to make their stalls smell better than the fishmongers next door. To perform in such an environment, you needed not skill, but a loud voice. You stood on a wooden crate in the center of the market and began to play and sing. A few people glanced at you, then walked away. You raised your voice and switched to a livelier song, not a courtly love poem, but a funny tale of a foolish knight who was thrown from his horse. Someone laughed. Then more people stopped to listen, and a small circle formed around you. Performing in the market, you could not sing the lofty, elegant songs of the court. People wanted entertainment, laughter, something to make them forget, if only for a moment, that they would have to work for the Lord again the next day. So you sang narrative ballads about foolish nobles, cunning peasants, unlucky travelers, and all manner of absurd and bizarre adventures. This type of song had a special name in the Middle Ages, fablio, a short, pithy, humorous narrative poem, usually filled with social satire and the wisdom of the common people. Outside the market, your other important performance venue was the tavern. A medieval tavern was a dimly lit, low-ceilinged room filled with the smell of sweat and fermented malt, where a group of laborers sat drinking beer for hours on end. Their moods could be merry, or they could be violent, all depending on whether the beer had been watered down that day. Performing in such a place required a special skill, reading the mood in the air. If the tavern was in a cheerful mood, you sang lively songs and told funny stories, and everyone clapped their hands and stamped their feet to the rhythm. If the mood was low, for example, after taxes had been collected or a relative of someone's had fallen ill, you switched to slow, sad songs, telling touching legends and tales, letting people find a strange sort of comfort in their sorrow. If the mood turned dangerous, if someone started arguing, or a drunk began smashing things, you either quickened the rhythm, trying to distract everyone with music, or packed up your things and fled as fast as you could. It was in the markets and taverns that you honed a skill Bernard could never have taught you in the castles, the ability to think on your feet. Performances in the castle had a script. You knew who your audience was, what they wanted to hear, when to bow, when to take your leave. But in the market and the tavern, everything was impromptu. You had to learn to read the crowd's mood, and in a matter of seconds, decide what song to sing, what story to tell, what tone to use. Bernard said something that stayed with you for the rest of your life. We are people of the road, and the road connects everything. At the time, you thought it was just a casual remark, but later, you would realize it was the most precise definition of your trade. It was in a tavern that you first heard the news of the Crusades. A merchant who had just come from the north was speaking loudly of the Pope's call. Christians should take up arms and march to the Holy Land to recapture Jerusalem from the infidels. The people around him listened, some fired up with zeal, some staring blankly, others bowing their heads and continuing to drink, probably silently calculating how to avoid being conscripted. You sat in a corner and suddenly realized something. This war needed songs. In the age of the Crusades, songs were one of the most important tools of propaganda. You could not expect every peasant to read the Pope's edicts in Latin, but you could have a minstrel turn those words into catchy melodies, singing them in the markets, in the taverns, at the church gates. A good crusade song could spread the message further than 10 missionaries combined, and so you were drawn into a campaign of propaganda. The lords in the castles began to suggest that you write songs encouraging the crusades, hinting that the rewards would be more generous if you complied. The church, too, was actively courting those who could sing. You wrote a few songs about the Crusaders, painting the distant Jerusalem as a golden, shining holy city, the crusading knights as brave and fearless warriors of faith, the women left behind at home as models of unwavering loyalty. Were these songs beautiful? Yes. Were they true? You did not know. You had never been to Jerusalem, and your entire understanding of the war came from the stories of others and your own imagination. One evening, you met a group of soldiers returning from the east on the road. They were nothing like the triumphant heroes you had imagined. Their clothes were tattered and ragged, their faces gaunt and haggard, their eyes empty and lifeless. One man was missing an arm. Another had a scar running from his forehead down to his chin. They did not sing songs of victory. They just walked in silence. That night, you sat by the campfire, staring at the lyrics you had written: glorious journey, sacred mission, immortal glory. For the first time, you realized that your songs might be sending young men down a one-way path. You kept writing songs, but from that day on, your songs had something more complex in them. No longer just simple praise and encouragement, but the bitterness of separation, the anxiety of waiting, the longing for return. These more genuine emotions made your songs even more popular. Perhaps people did not need a flag. They needed a mirror. But eventually, that mirror reflected something it should not have. It all started with a song you probably should never have written. During a performance in a tavern, you sang a satirical ditty mocking the inappropriate relationship between a parish priest and a baker's wife. This type of subject was common in the Fabliau tradition. Mocking lecherous clergy was almost a staple of the minstrel's repertoire. The audience laughed heartily, and you laughed too. But the priest was not amused. 3 days later, 2 men stopped you on the road. Men sent by the church. They told you that your song was an act of blasphemy against a member of the clergy, and that the local bishop demanded you come to explain yourself. Offending the church in the Middle Ages was no small matter. In 12th and 13th century Europe, the church was more than just a religious institution. It had its own legal system, its own courts, its own tax system, its own prisons. In many cases, the church's power even surpassed that of secular monarchs. If the church decided to make an enemy of you, there was almost nowhere you could run, for the entire Europe was under its jurisdiction. Moreover, the relationship between the church and secular entertainment in the Middle Ages was extremely complex. On the one hand, the church had repeatedly condemned minstrels and other wandering entertainers in public, calling them servants of the devil, spreading immorality and depravity. As early as the Council of Macon in 585, there had been a resolution excluding performers from the Christian community. On the other hand, the church itself made extensive use of music hymns, psalms, religious plays, as tools for missionary work and education. And in practice, Many nobles supported both clergy and minstrels, who often worked side by side in the same castle irate hall. You were brought before the bishop. You thought you would face a harsh trial, but the reality was more nuanced than you had expected. The bishop was a middle-aged man, his expression stern but not unkind. After hearing your case, he did not fly into a rage, but asked you in a calm tone if you knew the consequences of your song. You said nothing, bowing your head in penance, promising never to sing a song like it again. The bishop fell silent for a moment, then handed down your penance. You had to spend 3 days at a nearby monastery, helping the monks copy scriptures to atone for your sin. 3 days of copying scriptures left your wrists aching so badly they were almost broken. But compared to the other possible punishments, public flogging, imprisonment in the dungeon, or excommunication, it was a light sentence indeed. You had, it seemed, met a relatively enlightened bishop. Among the monastery scribes, the monks would occasionally draw strange doodles in the margins of the parchment manuscripts. Upside-down monkeys, rabbits playing the violin, knights fighting on the backs of snails. During those 3 days of copying scriptures, you saw with your own eyes a drawing of a knight riding a giant snail, and you barely managed to hold back a laugh. This experience taught you an important lesson. You could satirize nobles, mock peasants, even criticize the king in veiled terms. But you had to be careful with the church. When Bernard heard what had happened, he only said one thing. You should have learned that lesson a long time ago. Around the time of your run-in with the church, Bernard's health began to decline. After all, he had been walking the roads for decades. His joints grew stiff, especially his fingers. Those fingers that had once danced across the strings could barely bend on cloudy days. His steps slowed too, and sometimes you had to deliberately walk more slowly to wait for him. He would not admit he was growing old, but you could see it plain as day. Then, in a moment you never saw coming, your fate took another turn. You were performing at a feast held by an earl. This was your 3rd visit to this castle, and you had been well received every time before. But this time was different. This time, after you finished singing, the earl called you to his side and said, "I want you to stay." What he meant was that he wanted to hire you as his personal minstrel, a permanent roof over your head, regular food, new clothes, and occasional rewards. In return, you would perform at his feasts, write paeans in his honor, entertain his guests, and, when needed, pass on political messages wrapped in song. This was the patronage system of the Middle Ages, a powerful noble acting as your protector and provider, and you serving him with your talent. It was the best career security a minstrel could hope for, and not everyone was lucky enough to get it. You looked at Bernard, and he nodded at you. So you stayed, and Bernard continued on his way. On the morning you parted, he said no sentimental words. He just pressed a roll of parchment covered in his best lyrics into your hand and said, "These are the best things I've written in my life. Keep them. If ever you run out of inspiration, you can steal a line or two." Then he turned and walked away, his thin figure slowly disappearing into the morning mist. You never saw him again. You took up residence in the Earl's castle and began the first and only period of your life. with a permanent roof over your head. You had your own room, a small cubbyhole in one of the castle's turrets, but for someone who had lived rough on the roads for years, it was nothing short of paradise. You had regular meals, not always good, but always there. And you had a new instrument, a fine viol, a gift from the Earl, its wood smooth and its strings new. When you held it and played it for the first time, you almost cried with joy. These were your golden years. You wrote many songs, paeans to the Earl's achievements, odes to the beauty of his lands, tales of the heroic deeds of his ancestors. It was here, too, that you experienced the happiest moment of your life. It was an early summer evening, and the Earl was holding a small garden feast. You sat on a stone bench in the garden, playing the viol, surrounded by lavender and rosemary, the air filled with the warm, sweet scent of herbs and greenery. The Earl's young daughter, about 7 or 8 years old, ran over and sat down beside you, asking if you could teach her to play a single note. You let her pluck a string, and she laughed out loud at the sound, then plucked it again, laughing even harder. She plucked it a dozen times, each time laughing as if she had never heard the sound before. As you watched her, you thought, perhaps the original meaning of music is just this simple. A single vibration, a single vibration. All the rest, the skills, the theories, the traditions, the schools, are just decorations added later, and the core of it all has always been right here. You remembered that moment for the rest of your life. Life in the castle was peaceful and fulfilling, and you almost began to believe that you could live out the rest of your days in such peace. Then a message came from the south, shattering everyone's calm. The Black Death. You first heard the name as a distant rumor, said to be a terrible plague killing countless people in some far-off corner of the East. You thought it had nothing to do with you. The East was too far away. Then the rumor became news. The news became a real threat in the neighboring lands, and the threat became a nightmare in the town at the foot of your castle. When it arrived, it spread faster than anything you could have imagined. You watched the once bustling streets grow empty in a matter of days. You saw houses marked with a cross on the door, a sign that someone inside was sick or dead. You smelled a sickly sweet, rotting stench hanging in the air, the smell of corpses that could not be buried fast enough. You heard the crying rising up from every direction, endless and unbroken. The Earl closed the castle gates tight, but the plague did not need a gate to enter. First, a servant in the kitchen came down with a high fever, then the stable hand, then 2 maids. Panic spread through the castle. The Earl gathered his family and fled to a small manor in the countryside, where the population was sparser. At least, you went with them. During the plague, you discovered a strange contradiction. Music seemed utterly powerless in the face of death, and yet people needed it more than ever. In the days of refuge at the Earl's country manor, you played and sang every evening. You no longer sang the frivolous courtly love poems or the paeans to noble achievements. Those things seemed absurd and ridiculous in the face of the plague. Instead, you sang simple, plain songs, songs of longing for home, songs of waiting for spring, songs of how to go on living after losing a loved one. People sat around you and listened, some with their eyes closed, some shedding silent tears. No one clapped, but you knew they were listening. You could feel your songs doing something you could not quite put into words. They could not heal anyone's body, but they seemed to ease the pain in their souls, if only a little. The plague finally abated, but the world was never the same again. When you returned to the castle, you found it was not the place you had left. Many of the people you knew were gone. The town's population had dropped by more than half, and the fields lay fallow, for there were not enough hands to tend them. The Earl himself had survived, but his spirit was broken. He grew more and more silent, more and more suspicious, and he no longer liked to hold feasts. And a lord who did not hold feasts meant one thing for a minstrel: your days there were numbered. Your golden years were over, gone with the plague. In the worst days of the plague, you wrote a song that would become your proudest work. It was not a masterpiece of technical skill. In fact, technically speaking, it was probably one of the crudest songs you ever wrote. But it had a raw honesty you had never achieved in any other song. The song was simple: a man standing in an empty field. All the people he knew gone, but the sun still rising, the wind still blowing, the wheat still growing. He did not know what to do, so he just stood there and watched the sunrise. No grand themes, no clever metaphors, no intricate rhymes, just a man, a field, a sunrise. When you sang this song by the campfire for the first time, an old woman cried. After she finished crying, she wiped her eyes and said, "Sing it again." You sang it again, and she cried again, then said, "Thank you," and went back to her corner to sleep. You thought perhaps this was what music was for, not to heal, but to accompany, not to tell people everything would be all right, because so often everything was not all right, but to sit beside them and say, "I see you. I am here too." In the years that followed, you returned to the road, but this time, the road was not the same as it had been before. It was not just that the plague had changed the face of countless towns. The entire age was changing, in ways you could not understand, but could feel deep in your bones. The most obvious change was that people no longer needed minstrels as they once did. It did not happen overnight. It was like a slow tide receding. Every day, you thought the water was still there. But one day you looked down and found the sand beneath your feet was dry. When you first started out, the vast majority of people were illiterate. Their only way to get news and entertainment was through word of mouth. And minstrels were the heart of that channel. But with the rise of universities, the growth of city schools, and the increasing affordability of writing materials, more and more people learned to read and write. They no longer needed someone to stand in front of them and sing. They could read for themselves. Then there was the change in music itself. Inside the church, a more complex, more systematic theory of music was developing. Polyphonic music began to replace single-line melodies. Musical notation grew more and more precise, and professional musicians and composers began to emerge. Compared to them, your old-fashioned way of performing, learning by ear, playing impromptu, seemed outdated and obsolete. You could feel the change in the audience's eyes. Once, they had looked at you with curiosity and excitement, the eager gaze of people saying, "Tell me a new story." Now they looked at you with politeness, even a little pity, the way one looks at an old relic. As for when the tradition of the minstrel officially ended, Historians have never reached a consensus, for a cultural tradition does not die at a precise moment. Like a person, it is more like a river, slowly branching into countless small streams, seeping into the earth until it is no longer visible, but its mark remains in the soil. You too were seeping into the soil. You just did not realize it yet. You kept walking the road, from one town that needed you less and less to another that needed you less and less. Your instrument was still in your hand, your voice still strong. You could still strong, but fewer and fewer people listened. When you sang in the taverns, a few young men in the corner would be reading a hand-copied storybook, glancing up at you occasionally before going back to their pages. For the first time, you felt an emptiness deeper than hunger. You thought about changing your trade. You had seen other minstrels do it. Some went to monasteries to become scribes. Some joined craft guilds in the towns to learn a trade. Some simply returned to their hometowns to farm the land. A minstrel you had met many times on the road later became a schoolteacher in a small town, teaching children to read and write Latin. You thought that was a good life, at least. No more sleeping rough on the road. But you could not bring yourself to change because you knew how to do nothing else. All your skills playing the instrument, singing, telling stories, reading the mood of a crowd, were tailor-made for this profession. Without it, you were like a fish pulled out of water. You could only keep swimming forward even as the water grew shallower and shallower. And then you began to forget. Once your memory had stored hundreds of songs, but now some of the lyrics grew fuzzy. Some of the melodies you could only remember the first few notes of, the rest slipping away. You tried to remember the first song Bernard had taught you, and after thinking for a long time, you could only recall the rough shape of the melody. The lyrics were gone completely. This filled you with panic. Those songs were your whole life. If they were gone, what was left of you? You began to stop by the roadside and write the lyrics in the mud with a stick. Your writing skills were minimal, learned only in those 3 days of copying scriptures at the monastery. The words you wrote were crooked and misshapen, full of spelling mistakes. But it was better than writing nothing at all. You kept walking, kept singing, but you knew in your heart that your time was over. You sat down under an old tree, a tree that reminded you of the oak where you had written your first song all those years ago. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the back of your hand. Your hand was covered in wrinkles and age spots, your joints swollen and gnarled. The hard calluses on your fingertips worn thin with time. Your instrument rested on your knees. The fine viol the Earl had given you, which had been with you for most of your life. Its wooden body was crisscrossed with cracks, souvenirs of years of bumps and knocks on the road. One crack had been caused by a drunk man slamming his fist on a tavern table, and you had filled it with beeswax, but the mark still remained, just like the marks on your own body. You began to play with no audience. An occasional traveler passed by on the road, glancing at you before continuing on their way. A small boy stopped to watch you for a moment, his eyes bright, the same bright eyes you had had as a young boy, when you first listened in secret to the sound of the viol from outside the Lord's manor window. But his mother pulled him away quickly. You played a wordless melody, a melody of the road, flowing from your fingers. A melody of all the roads you had walked, the muddy roads of spring, The dusty roads of summer, the leaf-strewn roads of autumn, the frosty roads of winter, a melody of all the people you had met on the road. Bernard, the countess who had given you the silver coin, the people who had sat around you and listened to your songs during the plague. A melody of all the people who had vanished on the road. The melody was simple, but simple things are sometimes the hardest to play, because you have no fancy skills to hide behind. Every note is clear and transparent as a drop of water. You thought of Bernard's words. Melodies are not something you make up. They are something you pick up from the world. And now, you finally understood them completely. All the roads you had walked, all the people you had met, all the joy and suffering you had experienced. They had all become the notes beneath your fingers. You were not composing a song, you were playing your life. You played the last note, and the vibration of the strings faded away, the sound disappearing into the air. You looked up at the road stretching out into the distance. You were too old to walk any further, but the road was still there, like a river that would never dry up. Perhaps tomorrow, a young man would walk down this road, a fiddle slung over his back, his eyes shining with the same light as yours had been all those years ago. Perhaps the songs he sang would be nothing like yours, different words, different melodies, different stories. But that urge, that need to sing a song for someone, would never change. You set the viol down, leaning it against the tree trunk, and closed your eyes. Fragments of memories flashed before your eyes. Bernard teaching you to play the viol by the campfire that night, his fingers dancing across the strings, his shadow cast on the tree trunk like a flying bird. The afternoon you first sang in a castle great hall, your fingers trembling with nerves. The old woman who had asked you to sing your song again during the plague. The countless mornings and evenings you had walked the road. Some memories were clear, some were faded, all blending together into a warm, soft glow, like the last unburnt piece of charcoal in a winter fireplace. You had never owned any land, any house, any title in your life. All you had was a fiddle, a pair of feet that had walked countless roads, and the songs stored in your memory. But in that moment, you thought it was enough. Not that you had no regrets. There were countless things you regretted. But if you could live your life over again, you would still have knelt by the Lord's manor window on that autumn evening, listening in secret to that melody, because that melody had given you an entire road, and an entire road had given you an entire life. The wind blew in from the distant valley, carrying the scent of grass and earth. If you listened closely, you could almost hear a melody in the wind, someone singing far, far away. Perhaps it was just the wind playing tricks on you. Perhaps it was not.